Why keep trying? Why not just quit? And one day he screamed at me one too many times, and I just dropped the racket down and I walked off the tennis court. He's, get back here, I'll never show you anything again. That day I ceased being my father's son. I walked off the court and I walked the 2 miles home. And I knew there's nothing I can do that'll ever be good enough for my dad to be pleased with me. So I quit trying. And I put myself to the one thing I could do well. I could do one thing well. I could think like a fish. I could catch a fish when nobody else could catch a fish. And it was the only thing in life I could do well. And so I fished 365 days a year, every day in Daytona Beach. So growing up surrounded by water, I was on the water fishing. But see, pain seeks pleasure. I had the pain of feeling like I didn't have a place in my Father's heart. It's the pain of feeling like your heart was going to explode. For some of you, it was like an elephant standing on your chest. Others, it was like a boa constrictor wrapped around you. Others, it was like a knot that was right here. And by 12, 13, 14 years old, pain seeks pleasure. If you don't feel like you have a place in the Father's heart, the place you were created for, you give yourself to counterfeit affections. And so by 12 years old, I was addicted to pornography. By 12 years old, addicted to self-gratification. By 17 years old, a drug addict. But one thing you can do, you can still be stoned out of your mind and you can still go fishing. And you can still catch fish. And I went to work on fishing boats. And then very young in my 20s, I became a captain of fishing boats. I was the youngest captain of a commercial fishing boat off of the East Coast as far as I knew and off the coast of Florida. And by 1977, I'm going to sea fishing, making $50,000 US a year. Go out to sea for 6, 7 days at a time. But interesting thing in the fishing business. When you come to the dock after you've spent about a week at sea and you haven't seen land and you come back with a load of snapper and grouper, you unload the catch and they have a tally board, a chalkboard in the fish house. And whoever's caught the most pounds of fish that month's name at the top. And whatever fishing boat's caught the least is name at the bottom. Oh, I know this game. And if you saw the movie Perfect Storm, you may have saw how the fisherman that didn't have the catch was shamed, how George Clooney was shamed. He was shamed by the boat owner. He was shamed by the other captains. He was shamed by the people in the bars. He was shamed by his own crew members because he was not putting out what it took to be the best at what you do. It's society as a whole. It's the school systems. It's the business world. It's the religious world. We value people for how well they can perform, and we're not realizing all through our childhood years into our adult years, from home to school to church to work, a habit structure of thinking is being built that says you only have a place of value when you're at the top. But how many of us here were chosen second, third, or last when everybody was picked? And it leaves most of us with a fear of failure, a fear of rejection, not only with others, but with God. How many came forward saying they still battle the fears? Now, an interesting thing happened. There's a phrase in the snapper grouper fishing industry called top hook. On the Perfect Storm movie, it was the golden horseshoe. Each fishing industry a different phrase. But top hook is the one whose name's at the top, who's outfished everybody else. And when you come to the dock, you're the man. When you come to the dock, I mean, you may be shorter than everybody else, which I didn't have that problem, but you walk taller than everybody else because you've outfished everybody and your name is at the top of the chart for that month. And then you go to the waterfront bars, I mean, and it costs you because you've got to buy all the beer and you've got to pay the price of being the best at what you do. And when I'd come to the dock, my dad would be at the dock waiting for me. 10 years he wanted nothing to do in my life. 10 years he poured his life into my brother who was one of the top in the nation in tennis. But now I start making, in my early 20s, more money than my father was making. My name started being in the paper, in the sports column, and in the fishing communities, and about the amount of fish we would catch, and some of the tournaments we'd win. And my dad would come down the dock. You top hook this week, son? You top hook? Top hook this week. That's my boy. And he'd come on with me. Come on. And we'd head to the bars, and he'd have his arm around me, and he wanted to be with me. Yeah. 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 And we'd party, and I'm the man. I've got a place in my dad's heart now because I'm hitting the ball right. But there's 40, 50 boats out there. You can't outfish every boat every week. And you come to the dock, and my dad would greet me at the dock. You top hook this week, son, you top hook. And he'd see it in my face. I couldn't even say the words, and he'd look at me. And he'd walk off, and he'd go home. And I don't have a right to be in my father's presence if I can't beat everybody else at what I do. So just like in the perfect storm, I'd tell the crew, get the boat cleaned up, get it iced up, we're heading back out. For top hook, we'd stay home a few days. But if you can't beat everybody else at what they do, you don't have a right to be. You don't have a right to stay on land. Load the boat back up with ice, load it back up with fuel and bait, and head back offshore. And don't come back in until you're top hook and see when you're offshore now. It doesn't make any difference what the seas are, what the storms are. We're in a 44-foot fiberglass snapper fishing boat. Winds would come up 50, 60 miles an hour. Our boat's not coming to the dock when we're top hook. It wasn't an issue of money. It was an issue of the look. The look you saw in your father's face. And you either see in his eyes, you have a place in his heart, or you don't. And it all depends if you're acting the way you should. And if you're doing all the things you should do, that's my boy. But if you're not, you don't have a right to be. And I didn't realize, all the way into my 20s now, the destructive habit pattern of thinking continues to get bigger and bigger, wider and wider, as a fortress of thought, a stronghold, is being built for the next 20 years that will exalt itself above the knowledge of God's love. I became known as Captain Bligh, a rageaholic at sea. Because if my crew did anything to hinder us from being the top boat, I would explode and rage at them. Nobody could work for me. Nobody wanted to be on my vessel with me. Because when this boat went out, when we come back, our name's going to be at the top of that chalkboard. Now, an interesting thing, in 7 years of fishing, over a year's period of time, throughout the Carolina coast, after we moved the boat from Florida to the Carolinas, in 7 years we were never outfished over a year's period. We almost lost our lives many of times. I've been offshore in 70-mile-an-hour winds, 25, 30-foot seas. I've had the boat turned over on its side, upside down at least a half a dozen times. I've been offshore where 3 boats offshore in the middle of the night. When the storm hits, by sunrise, we're the only ones left alive. Because when we go to sea, we're not coming back until we're top hook. So by 27 years old, I'm making $50,000 a year going fishing. Now, we're not fishing nets, men. How many fishermen we've got here? We're fishing hook and line, commercial reels. We're catching groupers up to 400 pounds. I would take a 15-pound mahi-mahi live, put it down for bait on a wreck, and come up with a 300 or 400-pound grouper. I mean, fun. But making everybody's life miserable the whole time they're at sea, and nobody could work for me. Finally, we got on one bite of fish. We call it the Devil's Hole off of Georgetown, South Carolina, because 3 boats had disappeared there in the 70s. We got on a bite of fish there, had caught about 2,000 pounds of snapper, and then a school of grouper moved in and started eating the snapper. We caught 28 fish in 4 hours that weighed over 5,000 pounds. They were about 2,000 pounds each, or 200 pounds each. The biggest one, 315. Boat was loaded down. I called in a friend of mine, Brian, on the Ranger 4, and he got on them. We headed back a few days before Christmas, 1979. Made it on back right in time for a northeaster to come in, and it was blowing, and I'd hoped Brian made it back. I headed on home, and Brian came into Charleston, and I was coming into up near Wilmington, North Carolina. And it was Christmas morning, 10:30. I'll never forget the phone call as the boat owner's wife called and said, "Have you seen Brian on the Ranger 4? I left him on the Devil's Hole. He was in these giant groupers, these Warsaw groupers, or you're the last boat to hear from him." They never found him. Never found a life jacket. 4 men disappeared completely off the face of the earth. It's not uncommon to commercial fishermen. But that year I'd lost over 10 friends. That year had been the worst year of my life. My son was born that year, and I was a rageaholic even with a little baby. I couldn't even hardly risk coming home because of the anger that would come forth at a 6-month, 8-month, a 1-year-old child. So I lived at sea, just wiped out on drugs and alcohol, cocaine. But as my friends died around me that year, I couldn't stand it anymore. On February 16th, 1980, at the lowest point in my life, outwardly successful, had the respect of my father, had the respect of my peers. Everybody hated me, but I had their respect. And I went offshore of Wilmington, North Carolina, about 40 miles offshore, right about where we were at back in November together. I had the Doobie Brothers on. I was a rock and roll freak, and a bunch of drug addicts, pothead Doobie Brothers, rock and rollers. I had them playing, and my wife had been telling me about this guy Jesus, this guy I hadn't grown up with. I'd grown up in a church, but I hadn't heard about being born again or having an experience of salvation. And I didn't want anything to do with that. I wouldn't want anything to do with church. I wouldn't go near Christians. I was married at sea on my boat in 1975. But offshore, as the Doobie Brothers began to sing, "Jesus is just all right with me, Jesus is just all right, oh yeah," I began to scream at God. You know, it's okay to do that. And I began to just scream out loud all this anger. Everything I'd wanted to be in life, I'd become, and everything I'd hated as a child, I had also become. And I'd always said, I will never treat my children the way my dad treated me. And before my son's even a year old, I realized I had much greater rage and anger than my father ever had. And as I screamed and I cried out to God, I was at the lowest place in my life, and that all my relationships were shattered. As I cried out to God, all I can say, it was like sitting in Mr. Mullen's lap. I wasn't on my knees. I didn't pray a sinner's prayer. I'd left my crew at home. I was 40 miles offshore of land alone. And just perfect love filled that vessel. And I wept for the first time in 15 years. I stopped crying at 12. Men don't cry. Be a man. And for 3 days, I couldn't stop weeping. I just fished, talked to God. I didn't know how to pray. I wasn't raised around that. And I just talked to God, and I wept, and I wept, and I wept. And see, at the lowest place in my life is when I experienced God's unconditional love. I came home, my best friend jumped on the boat, fired up a joint, marijuana cigarettes, had smuggled in 6,000 pounds last night. A lot of the fishing boats do that. Handed it to me, I said, I don't need that anymore. What happened to you? And I told him what had happened for 3 days. I didn't even know what it meant to be born again. I'd never heard the phrase saved. I'd never heard the phrase born again, 27 years old. He said, I was raised in a Holy Roller Church in Ohio, and I'll tell you what happened to you. You were born again. And then I went home and told my wife, let's go to church. And she couldn't believe it. She took me to a little church she grew up in, a holiness church, an old-time holiness church with about 20 people, all over 60 with blue hair. And I walk in there with this long hair and beard on, and my 357. I did take it out from behind my shirt and did leave it under the seat of my truck, but this time, and I walked in there, T-shirt and blue jeans and flops on, just wild, crazy guy. As soon as I walked in there, those little 20 blue-haired ladies gave me the look. I knew that look. It's so easy to identify the look, isn't it? That says, you're not hitting the ball right. And I came out of that place, my wife, what was that all about? And she said, well, it's the hair, it's that. Oh, so I went and got all my hair cut off, and I shaved my beard off, and I went out and got some nice clothes. And next time I happened to be in town, because I was at sea so many days, 22, 23, 24 days a month, we went back to church, and this time I went in, and everybody looks at me. This time, but especially the pastor. He came running up to me because my wife had been trying to get me to tithe for about a year to give 10% of my income, and I told her, you are crazy. And, I'd give her $5 to put in the offering plate. And I just left a $500 check in the offering a couple of weeks earlier when I was there, so the pastor greeted me at the door. I mean, he just greeted me at the door. Oh, am I hitting the ball right now? Am I hitting the ball right? And within about 8 months, they made my wife and I youth pastors in this little church. Now, that wasn't too risky, seeing how there was 3 youth in the church, It wasn't too risky. And I still acted and talked like they did, and I wasn't there on Sundays, and so I didn't get too indoctrinated because I'm always at sea. Be gone a week, and I hadn't learned anything about religion, didn't know much about that, but these kids, we started going into their homes and going into some of the poverty areas and just talking to the kids and hanging out with them, and within about a year, we had 50 of them, all born again and teenagers. Now, the little 20 blue-haired ladies weren't too fond of that because they took their seats in church, but revival kind of hit this church through these kids. Their parents coming in. Man, I got to go to Bible school. This is great. This is what church is all about. This is great. And so 2 years after I'm born again, we go to Bible school. We leave what had been my whole life, the sea. But remember my filter system. My filter system, as long as you're hitting the ball right, you have a place in Father's heart. And for 2 years, I'd been hitting the ball right, just giving all this money, winning these kids to the Lord, doing everything, to go. But I didn't know anything about church, and I didn't know anything about religion, and I didn't know anything about prayer. Prayer to me was in 2 or 3 in the morning after your whole body's shot from fishing 20 hours that day. You go climb up on top of the overhead of the boat, the top of the boat, and you just get under the stars, and you just get there, and you just cry, and you just talk to God, and you just be in His presence. But I didn't have time to spend pursuing Him. I didn't have time. You worked too many hours a day. I didn't read the Word. Now, you might hit a storm, and during the storm, you'd lay on the anchor for 1, 2, 3 days, and I'd just devour the Word, but it may be another week or 2 before I get in the Word. So I hadn't been indoctrinated on what a Christian's supposed to do, all the things Christians should do. And we went to Bible school, and I need a strong young man to help me with this. Where's a strong young man? Strong young man. Come on. He likes the word young. He's jumping up there right now. And so this is the New Testament Christian. I mean, he gets born again, just radical for Jesus, so excited, so full of the love of God. But so this was me when I went to Bible school. I mean, I am just totally sold out and so excited about God. But we got there, and I didn't know what a Christian should do. And so the first week, they start teaching us if you're going to be a good Christian and you're going to be a pastor of a church, there's a lot of things you should do in order to be holy, in order to increase in the anointing. The first thing they taught us was about a whole life dedicated to prayer. But they didn't count on my filter system. Keep in mind, I was completely born again radically, set free of drug addiction just like that. Never picked it up again. The day I got saved, February 16th, 1980, I've not touched pornography again for 21 years. Set free like that, was a pornography addict. Set free of alcohol addiction. I mean, so radically saved that old things have passed away and all things have become new. My spirit man was new in Christ. But what about the mind, will, and emotions? What about the thinking process? And see, the filter of the thoughts was, I've got to hit the ball right. And if I'm hitting the ball right, if I'm not. And so they taught us this wonderful discipline of prayer. And it was the first week they gave us the discipline of prayer. And it was a wonderful, beautiful, beautiful discipline of learning to get up at least 30 minutes early every day, because they taught us if you can't spend 30 minutes or an hour a day with the Lord, then you're not going to be a very good pastor. You're just not a good Christian. And I started thinking and calculating, well, if 30 minutes a day makes me anointed, what will an hour a day? Because remember, I got to be up here. I got to be more anointed than everybody else, especially since I was about 10 years older than everybody else in this Bible school. I've got to be more anointed. So I started getting up an hour earlier and spending an hour a day with the Lord. And then the next week they gave us a seminar on the Word that any good Christian, they gave you the piece of paper. You've got to read your Word through every year, and here's your 3 chapters, and you've got to check them off. And so, well, if 3 chapters a day makes me anointed, what will 10 chapters a day do? I'm going to read it 3 times through in a year. So they gave me the discipline of prayer. And that was a wonderful discipline, but they didn't count on the filter system. In fact, the theology was once you got saved, you got it all. And there's truth to that, but there's also things in our life that exalt itself above the knowledge of God. And then they took us out on the streets in this big city in the South, and you had to witness every Friday for 6 hours. And they told us the whole thing of evangelism. And any good Christian is going to witness. And he's got to get out there and buttonhole people. And then on Mondays, they'd come in and they'd give a report about who witnessed to the most people and who won the most souls to the Lord. And so they had kind of a list, whoever did and whoever didn't. So this one was trouble for me because I was shy. I could not talk to people. I was an introvert. And so they told us this whole thing of evangelism and witnessing. But I worked at it as hard as I could. I did everything they said I should do. And I got it down, but I didn't win as many souls. But I tried real hard. But see, they also posted all the grades on the bulletin board. Yeah. And they had those that were at the top, and they had those who were at the bottom. I just couldn't stand being 10 from the top. It just said, just tear me up. I've got to get up earlier to study to show myself approved by God. And so I went to work on that one, okay? Let me get this discipline. I've got to study to show my self-proof for God. Well, I got close to the top. I never got to the top, but I got close to the top. But see, then they send you out to pastor a church when you graduate. And if your church is not bearing fruit, then you must not be hitting the ball right. And so you've got to bear good fruit. And if the church is not growing, and you'd turn in your numbers every month, and you'd send them to headquarters. And if your numbers were going up, you got a little letter that just said how much they loved you and how good you were doing, and it was just wonderful. But if your numbers were going down, they put you on the list. How many have been on the list before? I'm not going to tell you the first word, but well, I got it down. By now I learned how anointed I was praying an hour, so I started getting up 4:30 every morning, spending the first 3 hours a day in the Lord. I was spending 2 hours in prayer, 1 hour in the Word, reading 9 chapters a day in the Word, 2 hours of prayer. I was going out on the streets evangelizing, going into the projects evangelizing. The first year, I had the fastest growing church